If the mystery novel is at all realistic, which it very seldom is, it is written in a certain spirit of detachment. Otherwise, nobody but a psychopath would want to write or read it. The murder novel has also a depressing way of minding its own business, solving its own problems and answering its own questions. There's nothing left to discuss except whether it was well written enough to be good fiction. And the people who make up the 500,000 sales wouldn't know that anyway.
There is a lot to love about Rian Johnson's 2019 detective film Knives Out, and I'm not the first person to say so. It was an immediate critical and commercial success, praised for its humor and politics and general play on the whodunit genre from seemingly every corner of the internet. I'm not here to tell you that it's countercultural or unconventional, and I'd be a fool if I was. But as soon as the credits rolled, I knew this film was more than the sum of its parts, that it was certainly well enough told to be good fiction at the very least. In the world of amateur media analysis, there's a tendency to communicate in hyperbolic absolutes. What is the best movie, the best long take, the best performance? And to be clear, I'm going to be doing some of my own of that in this very video, but it always hurts me a little whenever a new film or game or whatever else is panned for being unoriginal or derivative. Like, do we expect a reinvented wheel every time we experience art? It's unsustainable and ultimately detrimental to the lived experience of artists to perpetuate a culture of such astronomical critical expectations, though to be fair, saying so is like saying that death is inconvenient. Nobody likes death, nobody wants to die, but we all experience it and we're all gonna do it anyway eventually. It's in our nature to want new iterations of the familiar, as the entire course of the 21st century media landscape has shown. Pushing back against that is just kicking sand into the Mississippi, but a trend is a trend is a trend, and it always affects everything, and we can't really just ignore it, so here the heck we are. Knives Out does not reinvent the wheel of the detective story. At best, it takes 3 separate wheels and cobbles them together into a convincing whole. This is not to say it is without craft or innovation. It's an exceptionally well-made film, but it's exceptional in such a specific way that even now I struggle to put my thumb on it precisely. Because Knives Out is arguably the Stranger Things of detective stories in how it references the classics both in the background and in the script. It's a film which embodies that specific kind of cultural nostalgia people have for a time and a genre they likely have next to no experience of. It's a film that plays in the sandbox of the detective story without making much of a mess. It is the textbook definition of a good story told well. Where Stranger Things is satisfied staying well within the boundaries of homage and pastiche, Knives Out is more of a present tense synthesis of ideas that has a very particular political message it wants to convey. The thing is, Knives Out is so well made and so popular and so popularly praised for its craft. Well, for reference, I've had the script for this video basically done since January 2020. As someone with a media studies degree who spent more of my life at this point thinking about movies than not thinking about them, and as someone who worked in film production for several years, there's a lot about the act of watching and analyzing media that I tend to take for granted. I used to work in lighting, most often as a grip electric swing, meaning that I would carry light stands and rig flags and silks when the grip department needed help, and I would run cable and fine-tune lights when the electric department needed help. What this means for our purposes is that when I look at a film, chances are I'm paying attention to things most people aren't. Things like reflections, shadow ratios, the angle of light, the softness of light, the color and intensity of light. And I'm not saying this makes me better at watching movies. In some cases, it makes me worse because I'm liable to excuse a bad movie if I think the lighting is smart. But it does mean that I know how hard it is to create a specific look. And that's just one axis of observation among many that feel natural to me because that's just how my brain is wired. And I get self-conscious when having these discussions because among film buffs and film workers, you end up having the same conversation so many times that a lot of basic stuff has to be understood as read just to keep yourselves sane. And on top of that, so much of film YouTube is just the same 4 or 5 ideas being reiterated ad nauseum to the point that you start to feel like you're trapped in intro to film purgatory. Ironically, what's kept this video in the can for so long is the pressure I feel to reinvent the rhetorical wheel every time I do a video essay. Can I really just talk about a movie I like for 30 minutes without having it be some kind of performance art? Is it okay that this isn't an explicit call to action for a global communist revolution? Am I just feeding back into the very hot take industrial complex I find myself so often opposed to by making what amounts to a glorified top 5 Knives Out Easter eggs listicle? Anyway, in 1950, Raymond Chandler published an essay titled The Simple Art of Murder, in which he explained how the classic detective story has, quote-unquote, learned nothing and forgotten nothing.
Fundamentally, it's the same careful grouping of suspects, the same utterly incomprehensible trick of how somebody stabbed Mrs. Partington Postlethwaite III with the solid platinum poignard just as she flatted on the top note of the bell song from Lakme in the presence of 15 ill-assorted guests. The same ingenue in the fur-trimmed pajamas screaming in the night to make the company pop in and out of doors and ball up the timetable. The same moody silence the next day, as they sit around sipping Singapore slings and sneering at each other, while the flat feet crawl to and fro under the Persian rugs with their derby hats on.
I imagine if Raymond Chandler were alive today, he'd hate Knives Out, and he'd hate the analysis of it that I'm about to give you. But also, if this essay is anything to go by, Chandler probably would have cited CinemaSins and Neil deGrasse Tyson as bastions of critical sanity, so maybe there's no such thing as an expert on art, and we're all just drowning in a sea of impenetrable subjectivity. But the point remains that this 70-year-old analysis of the genre is still as true today as it was when it was written, and it certainly applies to Knives Out. And that's what I want to discuss in this video. How a film so thoroughly mired in history can emerge as something more. So, with all that preamble out of the way, let's talk about Part 2, Hollywood. Here's the part of the video where I am contractually obligated to clumsily recount the events of the film to either jog your memory or give you enough context to understand my arguments without having seen the film, so consider this your spoiler warning. Harlan Thrombey is a prolific and successful writer of detective stories. One morning he is found dead, apparently of suicide. A week later, private detective Benoit Blanc is hired by an unknown benefactor to investigate the Thrombey family under suspicion of murder. The whole family, it turns out, was separately cut off from Harlan's money at the birthday party the night before his death. Harlan's nurse, Marta, is revealed to have accidentally given him a lethal dose of morphine, so he concocted a scheme to keep her from being convicted of murder. Also, she's an undocumented immigrant and she vomits when she lies. Harlan left Marta all his assets, much to the family's anger. Plot happens. It turns out Harlan's grandson Ransom switched the medications and killed a third party so he could get the inheritance. He goes to jail. Marta keeps the house. White tears are shed. Roll credits. Remember at the start of this video when I said I'd be doling out some of my own hyperbolic absolutes? Well, here we are. In my opinion, Knives Out is easily the best Hollywood film of the 2010s. Possibly this century, and maybe even of the last 50 years. But before I can explain that, I think I should explain what I mean when I say Hollywood film. You see, to my mind, Hollywood is a sort of paragenre in that films of many different specific genres still follow the rules set down by Hollywood's house style, what's colloquially called invisible style. A lot of basic film grammar is shared across regional film markets, but I hesitate to call it universal because American cinema is arguably the most successful and influential arm of the American empire worldwide, so of course every regional market has a bit of Hollywood in it. Within this paragenre, I have in my head this thing I call the Hollywood film, which is what every screenwriting course takes for granted as the thing you're trying to make. It's a tightly integrated story where things like dialogue and set dressing occur naturally, but also happen to be setups for future payoffs. They're almost like palindromes, where the beginning echoes the ending, like you could almost fold the film in half and find they have near perfect chiral symmetry. It's like if Chekhov's gun were a dandelion in the breeze, scattering so many seeds around the place you can't tell the important from the incidental. The Hollywood film exists above all other genres because its atomic composition is primarily stylistic, again, invisible style. Oftentimes, when something like, say, a great sci-fi film feels bad or sloppy in some esoteric way, it's not because it's poorly made or bad, it's because it's failed to live up to the platonic ideal of the Hollywood film. Something you are not immune to propaganda, moving on. The point is, plenty of films across every genre try to be a Hollywood film and fall short because they lean too hard on the specific demands of the paragenre. See, despite this being the dominant style, despite it being what's taught essentially everywhere, it's not an easy thing to do well, because what makes a good Hollywood film, for me at least, is deeper than its stylistic signifiers. But let's get out of the realm of the abstract and look at an extremely simple example. The second shot of Knives Out is of this mug being set on a tray. Later on, in a flashback, we see Harlan Thrombey drinking out of this same mug. And then, of course, in the very last shot of the film, we see Marta doing the same. Now, this is a classic setup, reminder, and payoff, truly basic story structure. Yet even this is remarkably easy to get wrong. The first shot we see of the mug is a close-up, but because we've only seen it once, we're not necessarily primed to see it as an important object beyond the irony of its pedestrian normalcy against the pseudo-Victorian backdrop. And of course, the third shot is also a close-up, but it's the last shot of the movie. It's the bookend. To my mind, it's the second shot that really butters the biscuit here. So the mug is not exactly hidden in this shot. Obviously, it's a white object surrounded by darkness, plus it has text on it, which immediately draws the eye, and it's obscured text, so it's even more attractive because we're hardwired to try to complete partial information. But it's also that self-same obscurity within the frame, alongside the fact that it's completely incidental to the scene, which makes it easy to write off. After all, we've already seen that this is the mug Harlan likes to have delivered to him in the mornings, so it makes sense that it would be here with him in his office. Now imagine that in this scene, as Harlan is explaining these monetary discrepancies and the allowance he gives his daughter-in-law, we cut to a solid 5-second insert of the mug.
Oh, Johnny.
What's up?
Oh my god, what a disaster. Incompetent, ham-handed cowardice at its finest, just a complete disregard for the intelligence of the audience. In the finished film, the introduction and reincorporation of this mug feel natural because they are incidental, and it helps that a mug just doesn't have the same naturally occurring plot gravity of a dangerous object like, say, a knife. But the instant you give us a close-up in a scene where the mug is otherwise wholly incidental, suddenly you've imbued it with gravity. You've made it an object of importance that will stick in the audience's mind. A good Hollywood film makes you feel smart, or maybe even cultured, because, oh yeah, that's the cut that Harlan was trying. Oh, I get it, because now it's Marta's house and the rules of God. Oh, that's so delightfully domineering. We naturally intuit the mug's symbolic importance retroactively, but so many filmmakers trying to make a Hollywood film include that close-up, which is literally the same as the filmmaker standing in the theater and shouting at the audience, "Hey, this thing is important. Pay attention to it. I'm a really smart director. I'm making good art. Hey, acknowledge me." Part of what makes Knives Out a good Hollywood film is that it's just packed to the gills with these little setups and payoffs, and pretty much across the board, they're executed with the same subtle and confident hand. You could do an entire video just mapping out all of these things, but I'm gonna focus on one in particular: the trajectory of a baseball. This baseball appears in 6 scenes. Number 1, in Harlan's office when he's threatening to share the evidence of Richard's infidelity with Linda. Number 2, Richard throwing it out the window. Number 3, Blanc picking it up off the ground. Number 4, Blanc throwing it for the dog to fetch. Number 5, Linda noticing the dog chewing it after Marta doesn't confess to Harlan's murder. Number 6, Linda returning the baseball to Harlan's office where she finds the evidence of her husband's infidelity. Laying these scenes out one after the other makes the story they tell seem obvious, which is always the danger of doing this kind of close analysis with an eye towards reproducible craft, because the key, as always, is in the execution. So as I dig into each of these scenes in order, just remember that they're spread out across the length of a 2-hour-long film. Scene 1, Harlan is fiddling with the baseball and then returns it to its display. Starting with this action gives Harlan a bit of business. It suggests something of his history with the baseball, that he'd be worrying it during this confrontation. Now, I don't know about you, but when I see an old baseball in a rich person's house, I immediately assume it's signed by Babe Ruth, and then proceed to relive the entirety of The Sandlot in an extended flashback sequence. Forever. So the fact that he's not precious with it continues the trend started by the mug, that while Harlan is surrounded by all these eccentric, expensive baubles, the only objects he really interacts with are surprisingly cheap. A ceramic mug, a baseball, an old IdeaPad laptop, laptop. These are things that make this obscenely wealthy man seem a lot more likable to us lowly proles. Scene 2. Richard assumes that this letter Harlan left for Linda is blank and is so outraged by the old man's mind games that he grabs the ball and throws it out the window. Let's pause here to do some basic analysis. The succession of scenes 1 and 2 start the process of making the ball feel important, of imbuing it with narrative gravity, which is immediately undercut by the deadpan conclusion of its arc. But then Blanc finds the ball and puts it in his pocket in scene 3. Since we don't know at this point who the killer is, we're still in the process of puzzling out who done it and how they might get caught. Richard's an asshole. He certainly seems like the type to do a murder, so we think, hey, maybe this will be the nail in his coffin. But then by the time scene 4 comes along, we've already learned for certain that Richard is not the murderer, and so have probably forgotten about the baseball altogether. But just in case you're still convinced it has some part to play, Blanc throws it carelessly to the dogs and presumably never thinks about it again. Then in scene 5, Linda notices the ball in the dog's mouth, and in scene 6, returns it to its display and discovers the open letter that Richard had just left carelessly on the table. And this is where things start to get really interesting, because now we're intersecting with another bit of setup that doesn't feel like setup. In Linda's initial interview, she says of Harlan,
"We had our own secret way of communicating. I mean, you had to find that with Dad. You had to find a game to play with him."
This, of course, sets the stage for Go being an important aspect of Harlan and Marta's friendship, but it also lays out the affection Linda has for the games she played with her father. Later in the film, after Marta's interview, we see Linda in her bedroom looking through these letters, which are of the same stationery as the letter Richard found in scene 2, except these are slightly charred. Now, the attentive viewer will have connected all of these dots and realized, like, oh yeah, this letter that Richard was looking at is written in invisible ink, and Linda's gotta use the lighter to reveal the message, and she's gonna do that eventually. And that's okay. Where some filmmakers lose sleep over whether their viewers will get it, other filmmakers fret over whether their viewers will get it too soon, which is how you get BBC's Sherlock, and nobody wants that. But a deft hand knows that an excess of information can dazzle audiences. And I mean dazzle in the stealth ship sense of literally crossing wires so that the audience can't even see what's right in front of them. So at first we think that the baseball has to do with Richard's guilt as the murderer, when in reality it was a symbol of his relationship with the Thromby family, one of resentment and disrespect. So in scene 6, Linda returns the baseball to its rightful place as a gesture of love, and finds the letter, which Richard would have known was a message written in invisible ink if he'd ever actually paid attention to his wife. Now, the extra icing on top is that when Richard flips the blank letter over in scene 2, we can actually see the impression of the invisible ink, meaning that the attentive viewer really has all the information to figure out what's going to happen from this moment on. But chances are you didn't, because again, none of these objects were ever made important in their own right long enough for them to accrue excess narrative gravity. They exist within scenes as business for the actors or focal points for larger conflicts, and their intersections and position changes baffle us away from seeing that which seems obvious when you lay it out in a YouTube video. Also, just generally, Knives Out is a masterclass in set design as dazzling camouflage. It really cannot be overstated just how important the props department was to the success of this film. For me, this is the quintessence of the Hollywood film, that alchemical miracle of artistry which makes such a delicate dance of coinciding plot threads feel as natural as an everyday conversation. This is precisely what makes repeat viewing so rewarding, because there's so much that feels natural and normal and unremarkable that was wholly intentional and in fact integral to the whole. But up until now, we've only really talked about the writing, which is just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. In part 2 of this video essay, I will be discussing how the image itself tells a story, and more importantly, what that story means to us politically. See you then. It has been almost a full calendar year since my last video essay, which means I've got a lot of names to read. Here we go. Jenny Wang, Catherine Crawl, Game Over Girl, Emma Sylvia, Alan Plum, Amy Mims, Anarcho Duck, Anne-Marie Bernier, Afiette, Austin Macaulay, Blake, Cam Chacon, Cayenne Shepherd, Cynthia Darling, Elise Alway, Emily Rains, Faye, Gary Marshall, Innate Optimist, Jay Jorts, Jennifer Palmer, Summer, J MacD, June Circuit, L something something, Mad Figs, Marcus Kitzinger Swooshy Cube, Emily Cocornell, Natalie Watts, Nate Kiernan, Nilgary, Not Sam, Quirk, Richard Daly, Richard Dunbeck, Robert Cutts, Scott Olson, Susie Minike, Set, Z, and Zavak. If you want your name read aloud in the credits of one of these videos eventually, you can go to patreon.com/LTAS and pledge $10 a month. $5 patrons get access to notes and scripts and various unused materials. For this particular series of videos, you'll be getting a commentary track for Knives Out once the second video comes out, which I promise it is not going to take another 11 months. The video is already recorded. I just decided to split it up because I just wanted to have something out for August. I promise this is not another Twin Peaks situation. This next video is going to happen. I promise. Okay? I'm not lying. I'm not a con artist. I promise. Of course, special thanks go to Eric Sophia McAllister, who you might know from the YouTube channel Curio, who helped write the script for this video and also provided voiceover for the Raymond Chandler bits. Also, of course, special thanks to the wonderful Molly Noise for making the music for this video. Links to all their stuff can be found in the description. Other than that, what else do I have? You can find me on Twitter at HMSNoFun. You can find me on Twitch. I stream sometimes. That's just twitch.tv/Sarah Zedig. Thank you all so much for watching this YouTube video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope you're going to join me for the next part, which is the part that I'm most excited to talk about. And the commentary track that I'm going to do for $5 patrons is going to be good because I have a lot to say about this movie. I wasn't expecting to have as much to say about it as I did, but I do. So, yeah, I think I've talked enough to let the names go by relatively slowly, so I'll see you again soonish. Soon. In a month, at least. At most. At most. At most. Not at least, at most. Oh, God. Oh, God. Oh,